John Humphrey was no stranger to solitude. He'd always lived alone, his nearest neighbor several miles away. His house, old and weather-worn, sat deep in the woods, surrounded by towering pines and tangled undergrowth that seemed to move of its own accord in the wind. By day, John found the solitude comforting. It was calm, silent, and his routines carried him through without much thought. But at night, as the wind howled through the branches and the silence thickened, that solitude felt like an oppressive presence closing in around him. The sounds started subtly at first, almost like whispers in the distance. One evening, as he sat by his window watching the moonlight stretch shadows across the forest floor, he thought he heard something. A faint rustling, like footsteps treading over dry leaves. He dismissed it as an animal, a deer perhaps, or some nocturnal creature making its rounds. But the sound continued. Night after night, it grew more distinct, more intentional. What was once a soft rustling soon became a steady, deliberate crunch, as if something were pacing back and forth just beyond his line of sight. One night, John decided he'd had enough of wondering. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out onto the porch, the old wooden boards creaking under his weight. He scanned the edge of the trees, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, revealing nothing but shadows. Just as he was about to retreat inside, he heard it again. A low, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled through the leaves. He held his breath, squinting into the darkness, but there was nothing, only silence once again. He went back inside, shutting the door and locking it with a feeling of unease he couldn't shake. As the weeks passed, the sounds grew louder and closer. Every night now he could hear something out there, just beyond the walls, scraping against the wood of his house, scratching at the windows. Sometimes, it sounded like whispers, unintelligible words spoken in a voice that sent chills down his spine. And then, one night, he heard it. A faint knocking on the front door. Heart pounding, John crept toward the door, peering through the peephole. There was nothing there, only darkness. He waited, barely breathing, before a second, louder knock echoed through the silence. This time, he could have sworn he heard a voice on the other side, soft and low, whispering his name. John. John. He stumbled back, heart racing, and backed into his kitchen, grabbing the nearest thing he could find, an old hunting knife. The knocking stopped, replaced by silence. But he knew something was out there. That night, he barely slept, clutching the knife to his chest, his ears straining for any sound. The next day, he decided to search the perimeter of his house in the daylight, hoping to find some evidence that could explain what had been happening. As he walked around, he noticed strange markings on the walls of his house, deep scratches that looked like they'd been made by claws, long and jagged, scraping down the wood. Near the base of his porch, he found footprints, but not animal tracks. They were large, human-shaped, but wrong. The toes were elongated, twisted, as if whoever had made them had walked on all fours, and they led straight up to his front door. That night, the noises were worse. The knocking returned, more insistent this time, echoing through the house as though it came from every wall at once. The whispers grew louder, shifting between words and guttural, inhuman sounds. John was paralyzed with fear, crouched in the corner of his bedroom, knife gripped tightly in his hand. The voice called his name over and over, each time growing closer, louder, until it felt like it was coming from just behind him. When he couldn't take it any longer, he screamed, lunging at the door, throwing it open in desperation. But there was nothing. Only the still, empty woods, stretching out in every direction. Shaken, he went back inside, locking the door behind him, but the sense of being watched was stronger than ever. He felt eyes on him, following his every move, lingering in the darkened corners of the room. The next morning, John discovered something on his front porch. An old, tattered photograph. It was black and white, faded with age, and showed a family standing in front of his house. But the house looked different, younger, less weathered. The people in the photo were all strangers, except for one face that sent a chill through him. A man standing at the edge of the group looked exactly like John, down to the scar above his right eyebrow, the one he'd gotten as a boy. John's blood ran cold. He didn't remember ever taking such a picture, nor did he recognize any of the other faces. Desperate for answers, he went into town the next day, finding the local library's archives. After hours of searching, he found a record of the family who had lived in his house over a century ago. Their surname was Humphrey, the same as his own, and they'd all disappeared one night under mysterious circumstances, never to be seen again. As he read further, he uncovered something even more disturbing. The last to disappear was a man named John Humphrey. According to the town's folklore, John was rumored to have gone mad, claiming to hear voices calling his name from the woods. He had been found wandering the forest, muttering about something he'd seen in the shadows, something that had followed him home. He had sworn it would come for anyone who bore his name, drawn to the old Humphrey house like a moth to flame. The nights that followed were a blur of terror. John heard the voices every night, louder and clearer, whispering his name with an intensity that shook him to his core. He stopped sleeping altogether, the whispers following him into the daylight, twisting his thoughts and wearing down his sanity. He became a shell of himself, the shadows of the house seeming to stretch and lengthen, reaching for him, enclosing him in their embrace. One evening, the whispers turned into full, clear voices, relentless in their call. He could no longer distinguish reality from nightmare. He staggered outside, the voice drawing him deeper into the woods, his body moving of its own accord. The last thing he remembered was a pair of eyes, gleaming in the darkness, watching him from the shadows, and a voice, his voice, whispering, "Welcome home, John." He was never seen again,